Welcome to the drought session, sort of part two. We had a session yesterday. Due to some cancellations, we've got some similar faces but different presentations. So we'll see how much you recall from day one. Very happy to have these panelists to my right on this session. So I think you're going to enjoy the material we cover, bringing you some different perspectives from a variety of institutions. And I'm actually going to kick it off. So I'm Mark Sabota. I'm the director of the National Drought Mitigation Center here at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. So to avoid some of that confusion, we're not actually in water for food. There's a lot of sort of climate mass and water here, but we're pleased to be a part of all these conferences over the years. Okay, so I'm going to kick it off with a little bit of an overview on drought resilience. This came up yesterday. I know Neil up there asked a question about this. Try to give you some of the applications, actual on the ground sort of focus with a lot of the things you'll hear here. These are things that are being practiced in the community right now at a variety of scales, but focusing a lot on what can we do down at the local scale. So I want to just talk about some challenges and sort of opportunities going forward. Given the theme of this session is sort of looking toward the future, we've come a long ways, as we talked about yesterday, in the last decade with that high-level meeting, with the Conference of Parties. And one thing I didn't mention yesterday that I'd be remiss to say, and I always tease my friends at UNCCD, they forgot the last D. There's only one D, and really, that's the convention. It should be the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification and Drought. So that's in their wheelhouse compared to some of the other UN agencies, for example. So drought is very well at home, and Daniel will take you through that in a little bit on some of the latest efforts. So as I mentioned yesterday, I will say again, it's our 30th anniversary this year, come June, come May, so soon. And I mentioned that we're sort of a boundary organization, and our job is to translate science to policy, science to the public, to the media. Basically, those blue bubbles are our stakeholders. And then our efforts are centered around the green bubbles, where at the Drought Center, our 25 staff have a good variety of backgrounds in physical sciences and social sciences and planning, and in these three pillars, if you will, and I think you'll hear a little bit about that today as well. And our job is to make information usable. So we do a lot of distillation of information and packaging based on the user's needs. So that's not done in a vacuum. I mentioned this was our footprint. So we've worked in about 95 countries over the past 30 years. The countries in dark blue are the countries we've worked with just in the last year or two, give or take, and the light blue over, say, the last decade or more. And you can see that, yes, we are the National Drought Mitigation Center, but it's not just focused on Nebraska or the U.S. The founding director is known globally for his work in drought, Dr. Will Hyde, who has since retired, worked in many of these countries as well in his career that went back 40 years. So we're just kind of picking up and carrying the torch from there. This is the conundrum I talked about a little bit, but it's worth showing again for anyone new in the room that wasn't here yesterday. And this is a challenge we have to deal with drought over space and time. This is the real conundrum, is we can literally talk about droughts on the scale of days to decades, and we can talk about it at a very local community level, all the way up to a multi-regional, multi-country level, can cover many millions of square miles or hectares, and last decades. So how you deal with that and how you avoid stakeholder fatigue and decision maker and policy fatigue is a real challenge. And so hopefully some of that will sort of come out on the issues that we talk about here in this session. So I mentioned the three pillars. This is what was really born out of what was called the Integrated Drought Management Program. That's what you can find at that URL on the bottom right. That came out of that high-level meeting in Geneva in 2013. And Daniel and Kelly, I think you were there too, and myself. And what we've seen over the last decade is really an explosion, but I think a good explosion in the sense that all these different groups, the developmental banks, the United Nations groups, the NGOs, we're all starting to talk the same language centered around these three pillars. And it's not a coincidence, by the way, that those 3 pillars are very similar to those 3 green circles I showed you about the Drought Center, because Dr. Wilhite's vision early on was integrated drought risk management, or moving from reactive to proactive, can be addressed through these 3 pillars. So they really took a 10-step planning process Dr. Wilhite developed and distilled it into 3 pillars to make it more digestible, again, sort of more usable, not as intimidating for a country or someone else to go through the process of drought planning. Okay, drought monitoring and early warning. It's both. I think there's a stigma that it's only forecasting. And there are a lot of research dollars invested in forecasting for drought. It's the Holy Grail. However, we don't have great skill out past a week, right? I mean, we do in some areas where we have strong teleconnections between what's happening in the oceans. The most prominent one everyone's familiar with probably is El Nino Southern Oscillation. But that's really stronger correlations in coastal areas. And what we've seen also, since I would say the golden era was between the 82-83 ENSO event and about the late 90s. Since that time, we have had ENSO signals where we've seen the exact opposite impact of what we thought we would see. And again, I talked yesterday a little bit about that non-stationarity. What is climate change doing to change the system? Those rules of the past don't apply now. So it's a little bit, chaotic. And Mother Nature holds all the cards. So our challenge is, you should be assuming every year could be a drought year. Or, we talked about the flip from too much to too little on the flooding side. So extreme events and variability are here to stay. And how do we deal with them? And Kelly's going to talk a little bit about the impact side of that, so I won't belabor the point there, but I think it's very important because it was not a typical part of drought early warning systems. And I know it's, whenever I go and work across the world, to me, it's the same as collecting precipitation or temperature data. Collect your impact information. Really, it's a gauge of where you're at risk. And that allows us to trigger action in a plan to hopefully reduce the risk so that when droughts do come, we lessen the impact. Was mentioned this morning, it was very nice to hear the speaker this morning talk about the Drought Monitor as her go-to source. This has been around since '99. Had the pleasure of co-founding this product with a gentleman from the Climate Prediction Center. And we knew that drought was too big for any one group to handle. So we work collaboratively with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So we sort of divide the load and author this. It's evolved a lot over the last 25 years. We just had our 25-year anniversary last year for that. We have 425 people around the country that provide input, serve as our ground truthers, their eyes and ears on the ground. Does this make sense or not? And eventually, it had a lot of policy implications. And 2008 Farm Bill was being the first big one. So that then expanded beyond just USDA applications. We know that right now, as of 2008 to present, about $29+ billion tied to this map. Averages on average every week about 25 million. So there's a lot riding on this map, and there's really no strong, consistent budget for it. It's ad hoc year to year. So we have to pretty much lobby every year to make sure that the cooperative agreement remains in place. And so that's what we do. But we're trying to change that. And as I mentioned yesterday, convergence of evidence. So a lot of pieces go into this, but no one piece is 100% typically of the answer. It's where do we see consensus of drought? You're gonna feel more confident if 8 out of 10 indicators say you're a D3 drought than if only one indicator says you're D3 drought. So that's the current map that I just flashed up there. So we have quite a bit of drought in the U.S. This year, as you can see here, especially in the Four Corners region and into the Rio Grande region and the upper plains and the winter wheat belt. So some concerns, and then we've had quite a bit of dryness down in Florida. Here's sort of that concept of convergence of evidence that can address different types of drought. Some of these indicators are more relevant for longer time scales, and some are more relevant for short time scales. We're also including in a variety of models and satellite information to go along with our information we get off the ground. So it's really a combination now of about 4 dozen or more indicators in any given week that we're using to make the map. And again, tapping into those experts at the state level to give guidance as well. So we're not doing that in a vacuum in an ivory tower. We're trying to be transparent on this process and give them ownership of that process as well. So here's a sort of a schematic of the hydrologic cycle, right? The drought monitor isn't just rainfall or just snowpack. Those are very, very important, yes. But we're trying to capture all elements of the hydrologic cycle. From when it falls out of the sky and works its way into the soil, then it releases into stream flow or groundwater, and then it evaporates or transpires back out. We're trying to capture all aspects of this, and we're trying to capture it over all these times that I mentioned up front across the top. So that's the challenge. And if we took a poll of all of you in the audience here today and asked you what your definition of drought is, we might have 40 different definitions. You know, getting consensus on that is a bigger issue as well. And there is no one definition for drought. There's hundreds of definitions for drought, actually. And it's what affects your livelihood typically is what it boils down to. I think I did show this slide yesterday, but just to reiterate, how we're taking advantage of new technology and advancing the science is using machine learning to combine all those inputs from the hydrologic cycle I just showed into maps that can sort of try to dissect drought into different time frames. The short term, the medium, the long. The bottom right is a new flash drought indicator we just started producing operationally last year as part of our agreement with USDA's cooperative agreement with the chief economist. So then we can start tying these to impacts and indicators and get a better feel for what may we anticipate when you hit a certain drought level. That technology then was taken to other parts of the world where they've seen our products. We've worked with them on a variety of projects through the UNCCD, Daniel's team, the World Bank, and sometimes they've just come to us because they've seen our stuff. So we've spent time in these countries and they've spent time with us and they've sort of modified it to their needs. There's no one size fits all. It's a very organic process based on the data they have and the time and resources that they have. So Brazil, for example, does it very, very similarly the way we do it. They have authors that actually make the map, and then they get feedback from each of the states, and that's very, very similar to the US model. The others are using more of a machine learning-based combined drought indicator process. Okay, just a couple more slides. I wanted to touch on applications, right? So how does this information get used on the ground? And is it usable, as I mentioned, as a trigger to a plan or policy? Well, in the red on the right, we've been working with World Bank for several years now. And sort of the Southern African region, or the SADC region, if you will. Two applications I wanted to illustrate. One on the bottom of the red circle is this early warning bulletin through the Ministry of Agriculture. So they coordinate with the Ministry of Defense, which is where the emergency management is housed. It's a good example of collaboration across ministries on the ground. This goes out to what they call the chiefdom level. At the local level, they have people on the ground that sort of validate this map for us. And they let us know, hey, it looks like it's too dry or too wet from what we think it is. It allows us to sort of validate the model and tweak it and verify it. So that's been a very cool process. That's still been going on now for several years. Hope to be down there later this year, and they want to celebrate this product. The top one there is actually an example of taking it. This, again, is through civil defense in Zimbabwe. And they wanted to show this as an application and policy to trigger actions in a national drought plan through their parliament. So I just wanted to show that this CDI combined drought indicator, what do you do with it? Well, these are two good examples of how you use that information and make it usable at the local level. So working with them at that level is pretty cool. Okay, flash drought, that's been touched on a little bit this week, so I just wanted to breeze through it quickly. That's talking about these rapid onset droughts. And the question came up after my talk last time, and Kelly, I think, mentioned it or asked me a question about it. This is I think, represents a change in what warming temperatures do to droughts and the characteristics of drought. So moving water through that hydrologic system faster, changing how long is it rain instead of snow, how early does it melt out in the spring, earlier than ever before. These are things that drive what we call a flash drought. Challenges to that, I've talked on a lot of these points, so I won't belabor the point on a lot of these, but where I'd like to see this go, and the way I've been talking about it at the high-level meeting, at the COP last year, is droughts are not only slow-onset disasters. So we need to think differently about how we plan for them because of that. They can pop up in days or weeks now. And if it hits a crop at the critical time in the phenological growing stage, it can have dire impacts very quickly. That does not take months or years to develop. Now, from a water supply standpoint, yes, Lake Mead and Lake Powell didn't go dry in 1 year. Mega drought maybe obviously did that, and some over-allocation issues did that. But really, at the end of the day, there's no excuse for drought sneaking up on you. And as Daniel mentioned yesterday, too, at the end, for me, it's always been, it's not about our tool set. We have a lot of tools at our disposal to track drought now. Yes, we can do better, but this is one way, is about trying to change the way we view drought as not only slow onset. So it's not about our tool set, it's about our mindset. And that's a huge paradigm shift, and that's something that we've been trying to work on for a good decade now. But different audiences, getting in front of emergency managers, to get them to thinking about drought. Fire might be that nexus point, because rapid onset can lead to rapid dry down of fuel load. And that can get their attention much more quickly. So we want to change that attention span line. Planning, this came up too, I think, as a question, did not show this slide, was emphasizing that we're working at all these scales. And drought originally was thought to be at this national level. And now what we're seeing is a big push towards individuals and communities. And we've worked a lot on that with ranchers, communities, the American Planning Association, to get drought in front of practitioners and show best practices. So all these scales are relevant: tribes, states, basins, national. And what we've seen now over the years is, as these early warning systems become more robust, the expectation and the demand and how they use it within these different processes, like I showed the examples from Zimbabwe and Eswatini, that as that becomes more robust, that need for information, it feeds on itself. So those triggers are what drives that motivation and benefits both. It really pushes you to keep improving and keep moving the needle. So that's what we're trying to do. So the three pillars, to me, really about the mission around the Drought Center of helping people reduce their risk to drought, helping society deal with drought, because we can't necessarily drought-proof it. We can't stop droughts from happening, becomes our umbrella of resilience. And really, you want to sit on a three-legged stool, not a one-legged stool. So we need to really integrate all three pieces that I showed on the three pillars, and not just early warning and not just a plan. And I think that's really important to build that full resilience. You really want all three pieces. And you got to do that through working with all the stakeholders, not just one or two. And those examples I showed were good examples of ministries working outside of just their ministry. So I think that's really a key reason those have been successful. All right, so again, just major points here. I'm not going to go through. I've touched on all of these. So I'm just going to finish with this slide. So to me, the future challenge is continually, how do we get people across the finish line? So we've done a lot of drought plans. Maybe they weren't full. Like I mentioned, in the United States, we have now about 47 states, I think, that have drought plans. Right, Kelly? We had 3 back in the early 80s. But 2/3, 60% of them, something like that, are response plans. So how do we get all of those to be proactive risk management, integrated drought risk management plans? So that's the chore in front of us. And I think that's true for some of the planning at the international scale that we're doing with our friends at UNCCD. A lot of them were already aware of the three pillars when they started. So in some ways, they're ahead In the US, we had all these states that had them as response plans, and until you have a champion to dedicate resources to redo them, that's where you're stuck on that. Okay, thank you. Okay, let's take one question for each speaker, and then we'll go to the next speaker, and then we should have a good 30 minutes at the end of the session just to open it up to anything you have to ask. But if you have a question now, I'm happy to answer it. Tough crowd. There are cookies out there if we need a sugar fix. Okay, hold your questions in. You can ask questions of me later as well, or any of the panelists. Our second speaker now is Dr. Jesse Bell with UNMC, working in that nexus of sort of climate, drought, and health, and wearing a couple hats. So Jesse, come on up.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate it. And this feels weird. Typically, when I'm at drought meetings, both here and internationally, I'm the last person to speak because health is typically thought of in kind of that last part of how drought is connected to various different sectors. And so I'll have to get over that and be kind of at the forefront of talking about some of these relationships. And with that being the case, I really want to emphasize the importance of this. I know I talked a little bit about it yesterday, about how drought impacts human health and some of those national and international strategies and what we need to do. And, Mark was disappointed yesterday, so I made sure to put this slide in there because I think this really does signify why this is so important and why the work that we're doing is so important, especially from both a national and international level. I always preface this. I was at a national drought meeting. I forget if it was in D.C. Actually, I think it was probably one of the first times I'd ever met Mark, and this was probably 15 to 20 years ago, maybe now. And there was a government official there from the U.S. government, and she said, "Floods kill people, but droughts destroy civilizations." And I was like, that is a powerful statement. And so I wrote it down. But unfortunately, I never wrote down her name. So I've been using that quote for years. But it does signify the importance and the impacts of drought. And you can look back in time and you can find these different occurrences of drought events happening and the fall of civilizations or conflict that has happened because of major drought events. Now, floods kill people, but I will also say that droughts kill people as well. And we've done a lot of work looking at this, even in the United States. And we find an increase in respiratory-related mortality with drought events in the U.S. We find an increase in cardiovascular-related mortality with drought events. We've seen increases in heat-related mortality with drought events. We see increases in suicide, especially in farming communities, with drought events. So these have major impacts when they occur, but a lot of times they're overlooked. And it gets back to some of that stuff that I was talking about yesterday, or the other day. It's hard to keep everything straight. It was yesterday. And that's because droughts, they manifest differently. They do have a quicker onset than I think sometimes we give them credit for. But it doesn't have that single significant impact. And because of that, we don't always see the impacts of drought right away. And that makes it more difficult to have conversations around it. That makes it more difficult to try to integrate it into health planning and preparedness because it's easier to focus in on those things that are impactful and you see them right away. But this gets to the point of what I'm most proud of what we've been able to do here, and it's building a case study around understanding those relationships of drought and health. It's engaging with public health and other communities to understand what are their threats, how are they currently responding, what are their gaps, and then developing strategy. And so we worked with NIDIS, National Integrated Drought Information System here in the United States to create a strategy on drought and public health so that can be more integrated into public health planning and preparedness and vice versa into drought planning and preparedness. And then developing tools and resources from this as well and making sure that those tools and resources have the ability to be changed over time as our knowledge and as our capacity continues to build as well. And so I talked about the importance of trying to develop strategy documents for other nations. And like I said the other day, we don't have very many examples of this. So I'm going to walk through a case study that we have here in the United States on developing these types of strategies. So like I said, this was a partnership between NIDIS and the University of Nebraska Medical Center. This was a accumulation of efforts understanding drought and health for roughly a 5-year period. And the whole premise of this was to inform and direct the future efforts around drought and public health in the United States. And my interest in this came from multiple fold. One of the reasons I first got interested in drought and how it impacts human health was actually because we were working on a national assessment around different extreme weather and climate events and how they were impacting the U.S. And one of the things that we realized while we were pulling this together, there was very little evidence about how drought was impacting health here in the U.S. And so that got me interested in doing more research. Then, another component, what happened was there was a major impactful drought, and I forget which year it was, but it was hitting North Dakota, Montana region. And there were people responding to that drought from a water resource management, from an agricultural perspective, but there were individuals, especially from the public health agency, that were reaching out and they were saying, we don't have resources to deal with the public health challenges that we're facing. And so I realized that there were opportunities to do better engagement. So I was starting to work on this in my joint position between NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And so I was working on this, and some of you may remember what happened in Cape Town, where they were running out of water. And this became a huge crisis for that city. And so I was working between NOAA and CDC at the time, and at that moment, what happened was CDC, I got reached out to through by World Health Organization, and they said, we need resources because we're running out of water in Cape Town, and we want to be able to provide resources to South Africa because they're having a public health crisis, and that crisis is going to get worse. And we don't have much around this. And I was like, oh, okay, well, we haven't developed much either. And almost simultaneously, through a different channel, the World Meteorological Organization reached out to NOAA and said, is there anybody that has information on how to address the public health challenges around drought? There's a crisis happening in South Africa. What do you have? And then everybody reached out to me because I was the one person that they knew that was working at that intersection. So I saw this happening at both spaces. And I realized that there was a lack of information to help individuals, help public health departments be able to address these challenges, not only in the United States, but globally. And so it got me interested in starting to work on trying to move this forward. And this is part of what this effort came from. And so I want to make sure I give credit to my colleagues that helped with this. There's many more, but in particular, Rachel Luckadoo. She is a public health policy expert that works at UNMC with me, and she helped with convening a lot of this work. So yeah, we wanted to develop some kind of national drought and health strategy, and so we convened a multiple approach to trying to address this, to understand what are the needs, what are the gaps, and convene stakeholders to understand what are they doing on the ground. This approach started off with a national drought and health summit that was held in Atlanta, Georgia. This was in partnership with a variety of different agencies, including the National Drought Mitigation Center, also the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, NASA, NOAA, and a number of other federal entities as well. From that, we brought together stakeholders at the federal and national level. One of the things that came out of that was getting regional perspectives. And so then we had 5 workshops that occurred across the United States. These were working with state and local public health departments to convene stakeholders at the state and local level to understand what were their gaps and needs. This also happened in the middle of COVID, so it made it a lot more challenging to be able to hold some of these workshops. So then we interviewed 16 health departments across the U.S. to better understand what is it that they were working on and what were some of their challenges as well. And so we brought all this information together and synthesized it, and that's how we got to that strategy document. And from that, there were basically four big things that came out of that. One, we need to develop more partnerships and collaboration. We need better communication and outreach. We need more research because there's a lack of research on understanding what's happening around drought and health. If you were here when I talked about this the other day, I can probably name the number of people that are working on drought and health-related topics on my two hands, or at least groups that are working on it in two hands, maybe even one. And then we need more planning and preparedness as well. And so I just want to kind of give you some high-level findings that came from that report. One, partnership and collaborations. We need to build communities of practice because what we found is places like Minnesota didn't know what Arizona was doing around drought and health, but yet they were still, even though very different systems, they were seeing some of the very similar issues. And there was opportunities for learning that could be potentially built between these different groups. We also need to make sure that we incorporate these into health needs assessments. And so when drought events occur, CDC, for example, previously when a disaster would happen, they would have a rapid needs assessment that would go out into the community to understand what the impacts were and what were the needs within that community. Drought was not typically one of those events where that occurred. Communication and outreach. One, public health departments are stretched thin. You probably know this. In the United States in particular, we spend roughly 5% of our budget on public health, planning and preparedness. 95% of our budget on health is focused on medicine, healthcare, end of pipe. We spend 5% roughly on trying to prevent disease. If we're spending only 5%, guess what? We don't have a lot of resources. Public health departments are stretched incredibly thin in responding to any disaster, let alone a drought-related disaster. And so we need to make sure that we're providing tools and resources so that those public health departments can effectively communicate with the populations that they serve, because they sit at the front lines of addressing these issues. And that we need to make sure that these communication materials are able to be tailored to the different states and regions. Because if you're in Nebraska, who the populations that may potentially are more at risk are different than Georgia, which are different than Alaska, which are different from other states across the U.S. as well. And like I said, we still need to do a lot of research and application and understanding the applications and doing research around this as well. Addressing barriers and data access issues, it's really hard and it's getting more challenging. And actually being able to access health data and be able to even access climate data now to make sure that we're bringing that together and building some of these relationships to understand what's going on. And one of the things that was really interesting to us, which we weren't even expecting it, and being in Nebraska, which we have a lot of private wells, no matter where we were talking to, whether what health department we were talking to across the United States, private wells came up time and time again, both with the threat of loss of water, which would be surprising if in the United States there are communities that don't have access to water during drought events, but then also on top of it, contamination within those water resources as well. And then planning and preparedness and making sure that public health and healthcare are at the table when drought planning and preparedness events occur, and having tabletop exercises. One of the things that we found was there was numerous times when we were having conversations with with states that were creating their drought plans, and they had never even talked with their public health agency within that state. And I've gone internationally as well, and we find those exact same things. Numerous times when I'll ask, how many of you that are working on drought preparedness plans in various countries around the world. I'm like, how many of you have actually been talking with the health agencies on these plans? And almost every time it's zero, none of them. And so outcomes, I can talk about some of the outcomes. One of the things that we did then was developing communication materials. And so we started in the process of developing communication materials for local health departments so that they can communicate around some of these issues. And so that's with both Rachel Luckadoo and Summer Woolsey, who's a part of our team, help with creating this. And so this is a toolkit where they can literally plug and play for their health departments that they work in. And so, in summary, there's a lot of opportunity still moving forward in this space. This is one example of what we've done here in the United States, but this definitely needs to be expanded internationally. Like I said, droughts likely kill more people internationally than any other climate or weather-related disaster. And that's primarily because of famine and malnutrition, but we have these other potential health issues that we're just starting to scratch the surface on understanding. And we've been doing that and trying to pilot some of these activities in Nebraska. One, because it's a beautiful state, it's where I was born and raised. But two, this gives us an opportunity to try to develop some of these tools and resources here so that we can try to implement them, pilot them, and hopefully implement them in other parts of the world as well. And so with that, I'll wrap it up if anybody has any questions, or we can move on to the next speaker.
Yeah, if we have any questions, please, we have mics on both sides. Or you can yell it out and I can repeat it for Jesse. Yes.
Hello. I was curious, I know you say there's not a lot of research on public health and drought. Has there been any efforts to look at historical droughts in public health? You know, something as simple as just looking at the Dust Bowl and mortality data.
Yeah. Dust Bowl is a great example. There was actually, we haven't looked at that one in particular with the association with health impacts, but there are documentation around the Dust Bowl and the health impacts associated with it. I forget, there was a lung condition that was very common in this region because of it. One of the things that we do, we have access to mortality records for the United States. So we actually have access to how everybody in the US died by each county. And we've gone backwards over the last 20 years, and that's where we've seen some of these relationships. When we see drought events occurring, we see increases in certain types of mortality. And that's where we're starting to understand and scratch the surface on understanding some of these relationships. I was actually surprised that we saw as many of relationships as we've been able to find, because when we think about drought in the United States, I wasn't sure if we would be able to connect it to health. I was much more confident on connecting it internationally. But again, we found pretty strong relationships where certain locations we see, like I said, increase in respiratory-related mortality, increase in cardiovascular-related mortality, an increase in suicide, an increase in heat-related deaths as well, because this is multifaceted. Drought events can increase dust storms, wildfires, change in air quality. They're also associated with heat events, especially during flash droughts. Heat in the United States, I said internationally, droughts likely kill more people. Heat in the US likely kills the most number of people.
Thank you. Yeah.
And this question, I was going to go to you, Mark. Sorry, I missed the first opportunity because I was still writing the question. So
We'll come back to you, Nicole, after this. Yeah, yeah, please.
So just if you don't mind, so I think, thanks for sharing your thoughts. And in my mind, to me, the most important of those three pillars you were describing is the first one. It's the assessment one, because it will shape the other two, right? But also at the same time, I find it to be the most problematic of it, because it will be shaped by who performed those assessments, right? I mean, I'll give you three scenarios. A particular country organization might have incentive not to report some of their shortcomings. Others might have incentive to over-report problems, for their own, I guess, benefits and assurance of continuity. And the last ones, for those that deliver solutions to those problems, you also have your own set of incentives, right? It's kind of like when you're a hammer, all you see is nails, right? So in your views, in your experience, how do you mitigate some of those risks that those assessments are set right? So the solution's also going to be the right solutions to the problem. Thank you.
Wow. Yeah. Appreciate that. A big challenge, I would say, on that one in particular, you have to really read the room, so to speak. You know that expression, where it's not a cookie cutter approach. It's not a one size fits all. It's definitely finding the right champion that you trust. And I said it on the drought monitor slide. I didn't belabor the point a lot, but I said science before policy. We have to be able to be sure that our assessment is as unbiased and as scientifically based as possible. Now, they're not always going to agree with that. And maybe in some of the larger counties or the western US where we're a little bit more data sparse, they're apt to say, well, that's not what's happening on my ranch or farm or community, and I get that. But we have found ways in the last decade or so to augment our in situ data with satellite models to do a better job of that, as well as each state has input into the process. But I would say that's still a huge challenge. We don't have all the answers yet, but typically drought's easy to become politicized. And as I said yesterday as well, no matter where we draw the line, someone's on the wrong side of the line. No matter how good the science, no matter if a computer drew the line or you drew the line or used this model or that product, if your payment from the Farm Bill is based on this level of drought, and I don't meet that criteria, I don't believe your map to be accurate. So we have to, I think it comes back to the science, so on the assessment. Whatever we can do to make it more accurate and be as accurate as we can. We've used the opportunity over the last 10 years, I would say, to expand state-level monitoring a lot as a way to start to overcome that. Now, they don't have a long period of record, but what that does do is it gives us more data in the here and now. First of all, where did it even just rain or not rain? And we have these collective cooperative networks that are ground sort of citizen science networks like the COCO-RAS, Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. They actually have a drought piece within that interface now. That comes into our national database, and Kelly will probably touch on that. So it's all the more reason to feel threatened by the attacks on science, what this could do to data delivery and streams in order to make all these sorts of products you're seeing here more accurate. Even reporting of health data, how do we start to merge all these together is really reliant on science and adequate resources and funding to do that. Thank you. Great question. Nicole.
Yes, I was just going to comment too, kind of on the data side of things, but maybe more in the sense of management actions. So your case studies, Mark, I think are very much more needed out there. And I know at one point the Drought Center was helping with a management database. I don't know if Kelly's going to touch on that, but some of those practical case studies related to certain impacts, I think, are very helpful for various stakeholders. But tomorrow we're going to talk about groundwater and the work that we do in California and some of the scenarios management scenarios, like what happens if you add a well and we run these models, and how does that affect the bottom line in the future in terms of water availability. But what if we also talk about a level of drought scenario too in those efforts? I think that's important too, is how we kind of converge all the best data and look at management actions for the future. I think that's where we're going to get to some of the solutions.
Thank you. Yeah, it's probably a pretty good segue. I've talked about the importance of collecting impacts and how do we tie it to indicators for drought that trigger some policy or action at a variety of levels. So Dr. Kelly Smith, the Assistant Director of the Drought Center, is going to come up and talk about some of those efforts both here in the United States and abroad. Kelly.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to give you an update on what I would call the state of the art of tracking drought impacts. And I will say the art has evolved over the past couple of decades. So first of all, why do we want to track drought impacts? It's a little bit of an abstraction. In reality, most of us say, oh, I've got to water my lawn. We don't say, I'm having a drought impact. So what even is a drought impact? If you're in the NOAA world or the climate world, it's important to be tracking how a specific climatic phenomenon affects people. But we tend to break it down within sectors so that it's easier for people to grasp. The reasons, then, for tracking drought impacts are for purposes of planning. Impacts point to underlying vulnerability, and knowing how we were affected by the last drought can help us reduce the effects of the next drought. Also for response and recovery, it's hard to know where to send response dollars or resources if you're not tracking drought impacts. So there's a real-time need for understanding where drought is having an effect. And also from a research standpoint, of course, as we study ways to build resilience, to build a better world, we need to know what effects drought is having in all of its singular direct effects, its indirect effects, its cascading effects. All that being said, drought impact data doesn't grow on trees, it doesn't happen, it has to be a conscious effort. So I'm going to tell you about some of the ways that people are figuring out how drought affects various facets of the human enterprise. The Drought Center recently completed, along with the World Meteorological Organization and the Global Water Partnership, this literally global effort to identify how different countries, different entities are tracking drought impacts. So I really can tell you a little bit about the state of the art in tracking drought impacts. What we found is there are basically 5 different main ways that people are collecting impacts about drought. One is through event-driven databases, kind of historically recording whether or not something happened. I'll give you a little bit better sense of what that means. And then there's what we call in situ condition and impact monitoring, or also crowdsourcing. Citizen science would be other names for that. Then there's media monitoring. What are people reporting about it in the press and social media? Food and water security monitoring, that would also be maybe called outcome-based monitoring, people who are trying to prevent certain problems. And then there's also data that may show a drought signal that was collected for some other purpose, like mortality tracking, for example. Jesse's finding a drought signal in that, but finding the drought signal was maybe not the top reason that people began collecting mortality data. So just so you have some understanding, I promise to be very quick about this part. An event-driven drought impact database is still, in most parts of the world, a pretty labor-intensive effort, if it's happening at all. People are trying to do it with AI and natural language processing, and there are some tools that help, but we still use human moderators. Somebody is literally reading the news to figure out whether or not a drought impact happened. And then in the case of the Drought Impact Reporter, the tool that the National Drought Mitigation Center established 20 years ago, the person literally enters that information into a database and documents it in various ways, assigns sectors, locations, dates, scales, all the different things that apply. And then it appears on an Esri dashboard, which is the image at the lower right. And then there are filters that can help you quickly look back and say, how did drought affect Nebraska? How did drought affect Connecticut? You can filter by whatever, by a number of different terms and criteria to find out what effects drought had. One use of this 20 years of impact data that we have now is in what we're calling a state impacts tool. We can associate drought impacts with different levels of drought on the U.S. Drought Monitor. So if I'm a planner in Missouri, I can go to this tool and say, how did D2 affect Missouri? D2 is a category of drought. How did severe drought affect Missouri? And I can give it a specific year, I can give it every year, I could give it a season. I can say, do I want to know for agriculture, for public health, for tourism? So it lets you drill into our database of drought impacts and associates the Drought Monitor category with that. So it's a fairly valuable planning tool. And this is an example of something that can be done with event-based drought impact data. You can also do logistic regression, if you like that kind of statistical analysis, whether or not an event happened at a given place and time. So people are sometimes critical of an event-based database, but I will tell you that narrative, scanning media, this is how people first know what's happening. If you have not made an effort to collect some other kind of data, then what you have is this general reflection of the world that comes from media. And it's the Drought Center didn't make this up. This is a credible starting point for understanding the effects of drought and other events that are used by other similar efforts around the world. Next, I will tell you a little bit about in situ condition monitoring. We have a system at the Drought Center called CMOR, Condition Monitoring Observer Reports. We say that it helps us see more drought. Each dot that you see on the map at the left is where someone has entered a report about how drought is affecting them. We're using an Esri-based system, kind of pushing the limits of what can be done with off-the-shelf software. People can literally take a photo on their phone and then download the survey, the Esri-based form, and upload it, and their dot appears immediately on the map along with a photo. And this also can be filtered and searched in various ways. I could drill down to say, only show me the reports that have a public health impact, or where they're saying that their domestic well is going dry, or where they've reported very poor range conditions. We have lots of different things that people can check off, and then you can go in and filter by those different criteria depending on what you're interested in. We encourage people to submit photos every week. We're currently running something we call the Seymour Challenge, inviting people to submit a photo every week during the growing season. Honestly, year-round would be great too, but we really stress that we don't just want drought reports to help us identify drought in the future. We need to see what normal looks like this year. If you have a basis of comparison, it's much easier to spot drought because drought is always relative to normal. So we're also working on exporting the Seymour system. We're working with the UNCCD, with Daniel, and the Sahara and Sahel Observatory based in Tunisia, I believe, to stand up a version of this to work for African countries. It's the same idea where it's the same technology. We were delighted to learn that this particular agency, the potential host agency in Africa, can use the same technology. We shared the spreadsheet, the Excel form that underlies the survey, and our developer built the dashboard for it. So it's the same idea. It can go from your mobile phone to a map literally in seconds. It's the survey form includes an introduction that can easily be switched to different languages. You have to provide a translation. In this day and age, it's fairly easy to get Google Translate to do the first cut, and then you find a native speaker to proof it for you. Then there's a map widget that can pinpoint your location pretty effectively if you allow it to do that. It checks off you have the opportunity to check off different impacts that you may be seeing, and then it invites you to upload photos, and then the fun part is you can go find your dot on the map after that. So we just have a few demo reports in the African Drought Impact Tracker, but it's been really interesting to see that this technology is potentially entirely exportable. And of course, within the United States and within different countries around the world, different cultural considerations affect how people may and may not want to interact with their mobile phones, and whether or not they want to submit photos of their surroundings. But it's working in some areas of the United States and Puerto Rico and the US Caribbean islands, and we think that it can work in some countries within Africa as well. We have colleagues in the Czech Republic that are also experimenting with crowdsourcing drought impact reports. They've taken a novel, different approach where they ask designated farmer observers throughout the growing season, what's your crop going to be like at the end of this year? How's your harvest going to be? And that's been a very effective technique for them to identify years or anticipate years where the harvest will be worse than usual. In particular, in 2017 and 2018, that helped justify the equivalent of $300 million in relief from the EU. And the Czechs like to say that they're helping farmers help themselves. Our Czech colleagues are also doing some media scraping. That's what this slide is about. It's still somewhat abstract. We're actually going to be over there in September talking with them about this, but they're using entirely open source a system that they've custom built to do this and to scrape news stories and then categorize them. You can see Africa, for example, has a lot of the pink squares represent health and society impacts. In North America, we have a lot of water-based impacts or hydrologic impacts. Europe tends to have more river navigation. It comes up more frequently when they're dealing with drought. So you can see there are some continental scale differences in the types of impacts that are being reported. And then food and water security monitoring. This is the example, the screenshot I've got at lower left is from FuseNet, which is, of course, unplugged now because it was part of USAID. I do think it was and hopefully will be at some point in the future a tremendously effective way to prevent famine. Drought, in this case, is one of the inputs that they're using to make predictions that can then work with humanitarian organizations or countries or different agencies to try to funnel food aid to people in need before the crisis is truly desperate. And drought is not the only impact, and it's not the central predictor. I'm sorry, it's not the only predictor, and it may not even be the central predictor, but it is a main driver of what's going on. So the point is that with an outcome-based system like this, it's not just about drought impacts, but it's about preventing a very specific effect, like food insecurity, famine, or it could be water insecurity. California also has a purpose-built system for tracking dry domestic wells in the Central Valley. So that's another case where a system is really boosting actually a health outcome by tracking these, by anticipating impacts ahead of time. And finally, as I mentioned, there is data that may show a drought signal. A lot of times it's collected for another purpose. Probably this map is showing what's probably the best, most consistently reported drought impact data in the United States. That's from the Risk Management Agency's drought-related claims database. They have a cause of loss database. Drought is one of the causes of loss. And of course, the reason this data exists is that people buy insurance and make claims, and they say it's due to drought. So tracking drought impacts is not what people had in mind, but this data exists, and it is potentially quite useful. So, and also something like, as I mentioned, mortality data can show a drought signal. So there are a lot of places where you might look for a drought signal. And of course, regional economies, economic data. But the data is not inherently drought related. You have to know the science, the causal pathways, and then from that, what sort of statistical relationship might flow to identify a drought signal. So the main considerations as you're thinking about drought impact data, if, for example, you're doing some planning for any kind of enterprise that uses water, at the very least, you want to say, okay, what happens in a drought year when we don't get as much water as we're planning? And that's where you start thinking about drought impacts. Whether or not you actually need to collect drought impact data, it depends. You may already know enough to act. Some key questions would be, is your purpose academic or applied? In other words, are you trying to do research, or are you actually trying to solve a specific problem? Are you part of a state, local policy team, or are you working on your own in some capacity? Are you an individual farmer or rancher? So then also think about who is making what decisions. Is it a government or an NGO, a farmer, an individual stakeholder? And probably most important is, do you actually need more data? Just because we sometimes hear people say, well, we don't have data about that as a reason for not acting. But if you know that drought is creating huge health hazards by people through water and food insecurity, you probably do know enough to act. Of course, it's great to be able to exactly quantify the problem, but that might be a luxury that we wouldn't have. So thank you very much. That's what I got.
Question for Kelly.
Tough crowd. Oh.
Yeah.
Kelly, I really like some of the concepts that, is this on? Hearing okay?
I think we hear you.
Really like some of the concepts that you were putting out there about, especially about looking at impacts and reverse engineering, so to speak, back to identify the true vulnerability, because that can lead to root cause analysis and actually fixing that or introducing a long-term fix for the future. On your impacts, are you also looking at geopolitical and socioeconomic type of impacts? I know one thing that the Department of Defense is really interested in is looking at the joint operation environment and looking at, out 25 years and trying to determine potential for hotspots. And, with water scarcity, which shows up routinely in their priority list, with water scarcity, you're going to get a whole cascade of various events. And I know Jesse's hit on this with the public health concept and the health related, but you're also going to get potential for civil unrest. You're going to get the population migration, cross-border movement, spread of diseases along with that. In your impact data collection, are you looking that broadly at the socioeconomic as well as geopolitical type of impacts?
Yeah, we are definitely looking at the socioeconomic impacts. Our data collection in the United States typically doesn't have a lot of these most dramatic effects that you've mentioned. Certainly some of the international databases that do similar drought impact collection, some of them do look at those socioeconomic events. And absolutely we would say, my longer spiel in a different context is that drought is it is a systemic stressor, and there is a whole category of vulnerability that you can eliminate if everyone had access to education and the decision-making power that comes with that, and of course, water security and food security, but key components of that are healthy civil society, healthy governance. So all of these different, the things that you do to build a robust civil society that can withstand these physical stresses are ultimately building drought resilience. So the things that you do to build resilience to drought go way beyond drought and climate and water to fundamentals about, do we know how to coexist on the planet with each other? Do we know how to share resources when they're scarce? So the things you're mentioning are absolutely part of the equations. And I know in political science, scholars of international conflict, some of the predictors are water scarcity and food scarcity, and then different characteristics of government or corruption or inequity and things like that. So yes, it is all definitely part of the bigger picture.
Thank you.
Can I ask 2 questions? I mean, am I allowed to ask 2 questions per session? All right, just a quick one. Kelly, and we talked before, but it's more of almost like a research question suggestion, because we talk about the RMA data. But one thing I would be interested to see is, once you take a deep dive on the RMA data, when you see persistent indemnities coming out of this particular region, right? Like they get claims every single year. Because to me, this is telling the drought is just half of the story, right? What it's telling me, they planted the wrong crops year after year after year, because there's this safety, network behind it that's going to, help the producers. So to me, that will identify a structural problem of the wrong crop on the wrong place year after year, other than beyond the point that the drought conditions probably going to persist year after year. So that's just a thought.
Yeah, that's a great idea. was chatting with Gus, it's Gus, right, the other day about this project we're working on to look at the relationship between drought and drought-related claims in the Risk Management Agency database. And it is, that's actually a really good way to frame a research question. Are we seeing claims on the same crop with or without drought year after year? One of the bigger questions that people have asked about drought insurance or crop insurance is whether it fails to give people the necessary signals to change what they may be doing, if it kind of locks them in too much to just continuing to plant the same thing year after year. So yeah, thank you. That is a good thing to look at.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Kelly. All right, last but not least, a dear colleague and friend of mine from the UNCCD is going to really talk to you about a cool tool that was just launched at the COP, right? And this Global Drought Risk Atlas. So Daniel, take it away.
Thank you so much. The last, but I'm going to be a little bit brief. This is the World Drought Atlas. I think I mentioned this on our Monday's session, but I'm going to go a bit deeper into this atlas. It was a collaboration between the European Commission and the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. It was launched at COP16 in Riyadh in December last year. So the World Drought Atlas is just trying to highlight that drought is a global risk. No continent, no country, no society, no economic or ecosystem is immune. We are all in this together. So millions of lives and livelihoods are also at risk of drought. I think we cannot overemphasize about this. And this is the atlas that is trying to refer to the parties of the UNCCD who came to discuss drought issues in Riyadh in December. And we launched it, and it was very much and highly appreciated. It was actually done also in the context of the International Drought Resilience Alliance, spearheaded by the governments of Spain and Senegal. And of course, this was also mentioned in our Monday session. So this atlas is a vital guide to manage and adapt to drought. And it's available online. I'm going to probably project the QR code of this. So the atlas highlights the complex, interconnected, and systemic nature of drought risks and the impacts. I think it's now time is overdue for us to look drought as a single crisis. It is an interconnected, it's a systemic risk. And it looks at all this root cause of the drought and what has happened on climate, society, and economy, and the exposure, and the different types of hazards, including the heat wave, precipitation, and many other things, including the reduced stream flow. And then this goes into drought risk and impacts, and then it affects our vulnerability, systemic vulnerability to drought. So there were 4 parts of this drought atlas. One was the complexity of drought and drought risk. Just understanding what drought is. It's very complex to understand. In many cases, it's easy to just misunderstand it. So we're trying to see droughts, its intensity is increasing, damaging livelihoods, and putting ecosystems at risk globally. So we try to see the systemic approach to drought, especially on sectors, the different sectors that are affected to the drought, including agriculture, inland navigation, energy, tourism, and a number of other sectors that were affected, and the different types of ecosystems that are also affected, and also communities. So it also highlights everything that is interconnected and the cascading, spiraling impacts of drought across all these levels. And this is a major drought event in the impacted systems. This is one of the maps that we produced in this atlas, where it shows drought is happening everywhere. I think I showed this map as well in the last session. The second part looks at the impacted systems at the global level. So we try to see water resources are vital for ecosystems and economies, and drought threatens their stability. And we look at all these water systems, for example, the water scarcity, the security, urban resilience, at agriculture, also crop livestock, and higher price, food insecurity, the energy, given a lot of case studies from all over the world in terms of hydropower, nuclear plants, inland navigation. So I think you will not regret if you refer to this drought atlas. And as I said, how does it also get into the cascading impact? Because it is spiraling. So it starts with a lot, maybe around 4 or 5 sectors that we try to identify in terms of rainfall and irrigated agriculture, water supply systems, inland navigation, hydropower, terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. So this keeps spiraling, and we try to look into this. what are the causes of it, social inequalities, conflicts, and displacements of it. And the part 3 looks into the regional perspectives. We try to zoom into a different regions because the way drought affects the different regions is also very different. And there are some regional perspectives on the atlas. So of course, it's not confined to arid regions. Sometimes there is a common mistake of commonly using drought and aridity as synonymous, but they occur globally. It's every temperate and also tropical regions. All kinds of agroclimatological conditions are affected by drought. So this is also highlighted in the atlas. The last part looks at what are we doing to manage and adapt to drought risks, especially at the UNCCD level with a lot of partners here in the room. We try to support countries to develop a national drought policy and also try to look into how we can mitigate the impacts of drought. So we are trying to really shift the paradigm in terms of its effects from reactive to proactive, but also to prospective. I think we did not mention this word in these last 3 days. We talk about reactive, mitigating the impacts of drought, just reacting to it. Proactive is mitigating the current drought risk, and a lot of options have been discussed. I think Mark was also mentioning a lot. And in this atlas, you will be able to see also the prospective approach to drought, trying to mitigate the future drought risks, not only the current risks. So trying to start living with the assumption that drought is going to happen, and we need to have some kind of measures like climate-smart agricultural systems, disaster-resistant or drought-tolerant water supply systems, land use planning to achieve land degradation neutrality, which is one of the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goal 15.3, where UNCCD is kind of a custodian, trying to help countries to become a land degradation neutral by 2030. 130 countries have now signed up for this. So just investing on your land so that you can mitigate the impacts of drought. You cannot just talk only about water, rainfall, and everything else, but also talking about the land. So these are the reactive to proactive and then to prospective approach to drought. So effective drought management requires an unprecedented alliance at all levels. We talked about the global level alliance that we are looking into with the intra, and also national alliance, local alliance, especially sectors and communities need to work together because they are all in this drought together. So I think this atlas highlights the need to work, the need for collaboration and coordination. So we must be able to align goals, coordinate action, and mobilize investment for drought resilience for a sustainable future. Thank you. And you will be able to probably take the screenshot of this, and you will be able to have access. Very reader-friendly atlas. Thank you so much. Maybe if they want to have a look.
Back to your QR code. Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Questions? Yeah, it's a really cool product. A lot of input from a lot of variety of sources that went a lot of work into that product. So let's see if we have any questions for Daniel. Getting towards the end of the day, we're between you and getting on a bus to go to dinner. So, Daniel, one thing I don't know that we've elaborated on too much between the session yesterday and today on drought is maybe just explain a little bit more on not just IDRA and that alliance, you spoke to it, and then where does that go in terms of this newer effort to develop the Integrated Drought Resilience Observatory?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Mark. With the IDRA, I think maybe I have mentioned a bit about this, where there was a kind of a stalemate on the discussion about drought. What should we do? We need a global policy instrument to mitigate the impacts of drought globally. And countries come like every 2 years for the last 3 or 4 COPs, and they were not able to agree on one global policy instrument. And some of them are talking about a binding drought agreement. Some others are talking about a global framework for drought resilience, the like of the Global Biodiversity Framework, if you are familiar with the GBF, Global Biodiversity Framework, because sometimes when we talk about drought resilience, we don't know. Maybe every one of us has different understanding of drought resilience. We need a global goal. We need targets so that we measure progress on drought resilience. And these are what countries are looking for now. The idea is to really look into a global goal on drought resilience so that we can have a global policy instrument, so that we have targets to achieve. So for some, it is about early warning. For some, it is about rehabilitating their lands. And for some, it's maybe doing more water harvesting, a lot of systemic approach to mitigate the impacts of drought, because drought is context specific. So the future is looking for a global goal on drought resilience, having a good understanding of what drought resilience is for a specific country or a region, so that we know where we are going. Because I think if we keep talking about drought resilience, but if we don't know what it is for you or for the country, I think it is very difficult. So the idea is to really first have a global policy instrument, a global goal, sub-targets, and then we can really come to break down activities on what to do next, context specific. So we are supporting countries. We have already now, every country, almost many countries have these national drought plans. They have these steps to go forward, but I think we need to systematize our approach to drought. We need a common framework. And this is what the IDRA is trying to support countries, alliance, peer-to-peer learning. Countries can learn a lot from each other. There is a lot of solutions out there that needs to be upscaled, outscaled, to be visible to other countries. So I think the future is not so bright, but it's not so dim as well. I think we are hopeful that we realize that at least we created the momentum thanks to the partnership, long-term partnership with many of you here, including the NDMC and others. It resonates now. Drought is going to be there. It's a threat. We need to tackle it. So, yeah, let's hope.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's a metric to these targets are metrics for success, accountability, and hopefully to incentivize them to undertake those mitigation actions. Yes, question here.
Thank you all for very interesting talks. Across them, I'm hearing themes of convergence, synthesis, spanning disciplines, creating new positions for people that actually can see and be in different corners of the world or of different kinds of thought, policymaking. And I'm just curious from your perspective, what you see in terms of the people, the human roles and training that are needed or you're starting to see perhaps to start to facilitate that kind of convergence. And in the talk just now, if we're going to span from local to national to global, there are people whose jobs that is, meetings like this that convene things, but where are you seeing the greatest success now in facilitating those kinds of spanning roles being created and or new opportunities, maybe even just with the data synthesis to speed some of this up, to make it accessible for people who maybe don't have all the training still to be very useful bridges in facilitating the exchange that needs to happen with the sharing of examples? Sorry, that's kind of a complicated
No, it's okay.
question.
I appreciate those thoughts. It's nice of you to sort of package that up. Do we want to start with Kelly and work this way? If you have any thoughts on her challenge, her question.
That is a great question. It is very challenging. I certainly see the need for settings and ways of coming together that really facilitate these different perspectives being brought to bear on a common problem, maybe a little more conscious political involvement to really convene a process around an issue that people can get on board with, and that lets them plug in at all different levels. Otherwise, we tend to get into these battles of which disciplines are going to prevail in a given conversation, and that's just never the point. It's how can we solve the problem. So it's making the context a little bit bigger, I think.
Thanks, Kelly. Jesse.
No, that is a great question. There's definitely a lot of opportunity in this realm, and I think about whether it's drought and health or other climatic events and the impacts that has on health. We need to do more as far as education and training both capacity building with individuals that are working in this space or that want to work in this space. And we see a lot of young people that are very interested in these kinds of topics and helping them find opportunities to be able to engage. But then there's also continuing education that's necessary for people that are already working and, healthcare, public health, that need that capacity building so that they can be able to do some of this work. And I think about this and how there's still not enough effort happening nationally, internationally. I held the first position that was a joint position between NOAA and CDC. And that position started in 2014 or something like that. And from my understanding, there is no longer a joint position between NOAA and CDC. There is one position that's working between, maybe there's more than one now, but WMO and WHO. And
WMO and GWP as well.
yeah. And so there are very few of these types of positions, but we need more people at national and international levels that can talk between different organizations and communicate around some of these problems. Because these problems are only going to get stronger and we're going to see more of the potential impacts. And we have the capacity now to actually address some of these issues. Well, hopefully we have the capacity now to address some of these issues. So as far as capacity building goes, there's a lot of opportunity and there's a lot more that we need to be doing in just education of healthcare providers, public health, but making sure that those resources are actually available so that they can address these major complex concerns as well. Because there is a lot of interest. I mean, every year we talk with new medical students at University of Nebraska Medical Center that are interested in these types of topics and want to be involved, but don't really have a platform to figure out how to be more involved.
Excellent. How many programs in the U.S. there aren't many doing what you're doing, though, at the Med Center, crossing over to climate, health, water. And, it seems to me, I don't know of a lot of those, but you tell me, am I off on that?
No, that's true. For the climate and health, there are centers.
UCLA, maybe?
Yeah, Harvard. There's a few centers like that, but that specifically water, climate, then health, and bringing in that food security, water security, and what does that potentially mean? Maybe us, and
well,
maybe
and I would say in their case too, but you're not putting health last there. That's through the Med Center,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So health really could be listed first if it wasn't just alphabetical.
Right.
So, I mean, I don't know that in those other programs, they are just originating within health departments. They might be climate working with the Med Center, but
Yeah.
opposite of what you guys are doing. So.
Yeah, and trying to build that in a more holistic way.
Yeah, great. Daniel.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question. I was once in a country where there was a huge drought, and that was predictable. They knew about it at the meteorological station in the ministry, but they did not spread the means, or at least the end users of this information, to the locals. So what I wanted to say is there is a capacity gap, especially at the federal level. Probably they have all the tools, especially FuseNet was also in that capacity, so they were informing them drought is coming at least 6 months before, but they did not really react. So at least what we are trying to do is we are creating a community of learning and practice to help countries to really discuss drought before it strikes. They have the tools. I think this drought impact tracker is, for example, a very good tool to increase capacity of people so that you don't wait for a country to declare drought emergency. You can speak up about your situation. At least if you take a photo, just put some, I think, you can dictate some kind of, because sometimes countries declare drought emergency very late. And they are always in the hands of those policymakers or authorities to really get the benefits or try to react. So if you start creating this kind of capacity from the local level, that's at least this is what we want to also do with the NDMC about the drought impact tracker. We created this community of learning and practice so that people can also learn from each other, this platform. So it's very important, especially at the local level, to increase the capacity.
Yeah, these are, appreciate the panelists' thoughts on that. They're very provocative question. Not a whole lot more to add to that, except to say that in our mission, and Jesse touched a lot on the education, I think from the Drought Center's perspective, We try to be very interdisciplinary. That's a real challenge, even in academic groups, to not be siloed in your department. Through the students, the training, immersing them in the projects, immersing them in our staff meetings to get a feel and a sense. And in the case of the Drought Center, you know, a lot of proposals now, you'll see sort of the bandwagon now talks about the social science side of this, and not just, oh, a bunch of meteorologists and climatologists and hydrologists talking about drought. We've made a concerted effort, you know, at least a good third of our staff have training both directly in the social sciences just for that reason. But even then, that's not enough of that full interdisciplinary nature that we need. But on our projects, we really try to, you know, we're doing one for Department of Defense right now that's got political science. It's got the computer engineering with machine learning. It's got the UNMC. It's got the Drought Center. It's got Spatial Center at California, Santa Barbara. It has NASA. So we've really made a concerted effort to bring those together to talk about, Dr. Rowland talked about a global hotspot map maybe 25 years from now. We're trying to do one now using machine learning and all those disciplines. So that was a great question to end us on here. I don't want to keep you between you and the bus. Thanks again for coming here in a late afternoon. I know people are getting a little groggy and tired, but it should be a great dinner and reception tonight out at the Pines. Hopefully you've used your map to find where to get on the bus, and we'll see you out there. Thank you for coming.